The CCSA, as you all or most of you know, is the Center for Critical Studies in Architecture. It is a research cooperation between the Art History Department of the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main, the Architecture Department of the Technical University of Darmstadt, and the Deutsches Architekturmuseum, so the German Architecture Museum, including team members from the University of Applied Science and Arts in Dortmund, the Heidelberg University, and the University of Kassel. We started the CCSA talks as a format to present current research projects as well as publications and discuss them with guests. We are delighted to offer this semester 6 different talks. As you can see here on the poster, one of them, the second one, is in cooperation with the Löwe Research Project Architectures of Order. Today's talk opens with the topic Emotions, Mission, Architecture, Building Hospitals in Persia by Sara Honarmand Ebrahimi. We are very happy that Sara joined our team in being a Humboldt Research Fellow at the Goethe University Frankfurt am Main. It is a real pleasure to have her here, and I really mean it. Her research interests address the multifaceted origins of ideas, practices in the history of international health and architecture, and consider the history of emotions as a way of doing architecture history. And this is exactly what we will discuss today. She will present her first book entitled Emotion, Mission, Architecture, Building Hospitals in Persia and British India, 1865 to 1914, which is not yet published, but will be published at the end of this month, so very soon. The monograph is based on her PhD, which was awarded by University College Dublin School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy in March 2018. In the scope of her Humboldt Research Fellowship, she is now working on British hospital architecture in the Middle East from 1875 to 1951, and she is continuing to examine the role of emotions in the context of colonial networking. And maybe in a future CCSA Talks edition, she will present her new research. But today we turn to Persia between 1865 and 1914. And Sara, please feel free to start your presentation. I will stop the poster, and for the audience, you will have the chance to ask questions and share thoughts with us after Sara's presentation, and you're very welcome to do so.
Thank you, Frederike. Should I share now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, fine. Is it okay?
Yes, it does work.
Okay,
Perfect.
Thank you, first of all, for the introduction. I should say that I'm also very happy to be here. So that's it's great. We're all happy. So as you mentioned, the presentation is based on my book, which is going to be published at the end of this month. And this is the cover and the table of contents, if anyone is interested. What I'm going to do is to provide a very brief overview. And then I'm going to talk about the place of emotions in the process of historical research, which I talk about in the introduction of the book. So to start, I want to start with the story of the foundation of the Kashmir Medical Mission, which was the first medical missions of the Church Missionary Society. In 1864, Reverend Robert Clark, who you can see here, a missionary of the Church Missionary Society in Punjab, and his wife, Elizabeth Mary Brown, visited Kashmir to find an opening for evangelistic work. They were greeted with opposition by the local people, who showed them that neither their religion nor they were welcome in Kashmir. Despite these obstacles, they opened a dispensary, which was largely attended. And they took this as a sign to establish or to open or the need for a medical mission. Subsequently, the CMS committee passed a resolution and they appointed a medical doctor to open a medical mission. This hospital, the number of patients increased in subsequent years and the hospital was enlarged and eventually it became one of the largest medical missions of the society. So here you can see the first hospital that they built in Kashmir. They later destroyed all these buildings and they built a new hospital. So this narrative summary extracted, and I made it very short, extracted from a series of articles published in the first volume of Mercy and Truth, a CMS medical magazine, is a testimony to how the publications of different Protestant missionary organizations presented medical missions as instrumental in opening the door to evangelistic work. With few exceptions, published letters and reports discuss how after experiencing a series of ups and downs, medical missionaries overcame the distrust of the local people who would otherwise be unreceptive of the missionaries and gain access to their homes, and here are using their own language. I think this quote is particularly telling. It is from the first medical doctor that they appointed to Kashmir. I'm going to read it. The people are much less bigoted than they were before, and a very large number of the inhabitants of the valley now look upon us as their friends, and in their difficulties and sorrows come to us for advice and sympathy. So the book is essentially about these codes or the language that the missionaries used about winning trust, affection, and friendship. And what I do at the very beginning of the book is that to state that it's important to not draw a false equivalence between present configurations of trust or friendship or affection and the state of feelings of historical missionaries situated in different places. One should also avoid interpreting these terms to imply pacifying or solidifying and to assume that the missionaries understood these terms in a way similar to other colonial or imperial actors across time and space. To understand the meaning of these terms in the context of medical mission work and I consider what changed with the introduction of medical work. Missionaries who were not allowed to preach and were greeted with stoning, according to some accounts, or failed to reach diverse people through Bible sale or distribution and even opening schools, could, through medicine, get closer to local people and a more varied group of local people and visit them at their homes. Therefore, these terms imply a change in the sensory relationship between missionaries and local people. They emerged out of a century of mission work marked by frustration and failure to reach a large audience. There were also differences in how building trust was understood, depending on the national affiliation of individual mission organizations and where they worked. Complicating this picture further was how building trust concerned female missionaries in different way and quality than male missionaries. While coming into close contact with indigenous people was relevant to both male and female missionaries, it took on an extra shape for female missionaries in the form of familial connection or sisterhood with potential converts. Thus, mission hospitals for women played a crucial role in changing the sensory relationship between missionaries and the local people. In general, The missionaries spent a great deal of time contemplating about their own and prospective converts' emotions. And the medical missionaries' practice of attempting to gain local people's trust and affection is an integral part of this history, which has recently gained a new impetus due to the growing attention to the role of emotions in the making of history, and we can see from these books. However, these studies mainly focus on linguistic utterances and to some extent on habits, rituals, prayers, and less on architecture or physical expressions. In my book, I draw on Monekshir's concept of emotional practices, which she developed in this article, and Rabbadi's emphasis on biocultural historicism to examine how missionaries sought to change their sense of relationship with local people through the design of mission hospitals. Monekshir's emphasis on emotions as doing allows examining architecture as prescriptions that facilitated certain bodily practices and does what she terms doing emotions, while body's biocultural model helps acknowledging patients' diverse experiences and variations in the relationship between the management of the built environment and the management of emotions. I show how missionaries' concern with gaining trust resulted in new architectural solutions. The emotional practices that these types of planning facilitated, such as cooking in the hospital or interacting with family and friends, did not take place against stable backgrounds of experiential feelings that just existed out there. Patients would appropriate, arrange, rearrange, or even categorize these practices and construct experiences. By introducing and examining these hospitals, the book also contributes to the historiography of hospital architecture in the 19th and early 20th century, which is predominantly about the pavilion plan hospital. And probably many of you know already about the pavilion plan hospital, but I'm going to just to remind ourselves. The advocates of the pavilion plan aim to limit the spread of hospital infection by allowing air and natural light to permeate every part of hospital. Pavilion plan hospitals often consist of long rectangular wards that were housed in separate pavilions, as you can see in this example. Each ward had windows facing each other along its length to facilitate cross-ventilation, as well as their own sanitary facilities. According to Beißwanger, the pavilion plan, and I quote, was the first revolution in the history of hospital architecture, a victory of science, philosophy, and technology. Historians such as Jeremy Taylor and Gian Kizowski further argue that this type of hospital planning became an international standard by the late 19th century. These arguments are based on the examination of a few military and state hospitals without considering mission hospitals, hospitals built in China, African continent, or South America, those constructed by non-British empires or by North Americans in the colonized world. An examination of all these hospitals is required for examining the extent to which the pavilion plan became an international standard. I think that Protestant mission hospitals are particularly important case studies for examining hospital architecture in a global context. This is because they had emerged as one of the main providers of the so-called Western biomedical services in colonial territories by the early 20th century. And although the secular and mission medicine in colonies shared characteristics in terms of disease conception and healing perception, it was the missionaries who engaged in major spending on medical facilities at the local level. A focus on mission hospitals challenges the assumption that the pavilion plan became an international standard. I show that the CMS missionaries disregarded scientific and sanitary approaches embodied in the pavilion plan to provide a space that could feel familiar. The CMS medical missionaries made and remade prevailing approaches to hospital architecture and invented new forms by disregarding some of the medical concerns of the time. And here I just thought I'll just some pictures to show just different hospitals so you can get some idea. I'm going to pause a little bit so you can take a look. And I also have some plans. Probably they provide, or maybe they provide a different picture. And now I'm going to focus on one of these hospitals, which is this one. So this is the Multan Hospital, and it was a hospital for women. It was described as having an extreme parde or parda arrangement. It was established in 1885 and was built in the 1890s. Parde or parda, which is a Farsi term, is a term that is commonly used for referring to a system of separating women through clothing and architecture in some parts of the Middle East and South Asia, and it is practiced by both Hindus and Muslims. So the hospital, as you can see, was divided between Muslims and Hindus, with each having their own section consist of wards and a courtyard. It is not particularly visible on this plan, it also had an inner walled section and an outer section. So the interior section was for the female patients. It had an entrance block, an outpatient apartment, and an inpatient apartment. And the outer section was a form of a caravanserai, and it was for the male relatives of the female patients. So although they couldn't enter the hospital, they could stay when they traveled to the hospital. In other words, the hospital, like houses in some parts of Persia and India, had an Andaruni, which is an inner section, and the Biruni, which is an outer section. The only difference was that the hospital's Andaruni was not a family quarter and was reserved specifically for women. Elisa Kent states that missionaries in India generally did not aim to force women to disregard parda. Their goal was instead to transfer female and women identification with home so that they could be preservers of the home based on the ideals of Christian faith. The CMS missionaries might have been thinking along similar lines when designing the Multan Hospital. They sought to teach patients new ideas about health and hygiene through a pre-existing architecture that was familiar to the patients. The parda arrangement of the hospital was meant to act as a reminder of patients' home and thus attract them to the hospital. In this way, the patients were confronted with an emotional setup, and once they were in the hospital, they would follow certain rules and regulations, learning in turn new ideas about health and hygiene. However, and there is a however is here, the hospital was not airy and was not bright, and it was not similar to an English hospital, at least in terms of planning. The buildings were dark and were not cross-ventilated. Moreover, the patients could move in and out of the wards whenever desired, and they could exchange, for example, news. So you can get an idea of how the missionaries disregarded scientific and sanitary approaches to provide a space that could feel familiar. The Parde system was an architectural solution to the practical problem of attracting female patients, viewed as essential to their experiences. Also, this picture, I think, is particularly telling. It shows friends of Hindu patients cooking in the hospital, surrounded by pans and pots. The decision of the patients was not a form of transgression. The design of the hospital encouraged this activity. The patient's move was in conformity with the expectations inherent in a Parda arrangement and the patient's culturally and historically specific preconceptions of the Parda system. In other words, this form of special arrangement facilitated the practice of bringing friends and families, bringing utensils and cooking in the hospital. If these practices did not evoke patients' interest in missionaries and their work, they at least attracted them to the hospital and encouraged them to remain. Meanwhile, Parde was not a meaningful practice among all members of a community. Some women did not favor the Parde system and would manipulate the meanings and representations associated with this system. Others who observed this system could also act as religious leaders, healers, or even promote female welfare and education. How women observed Parde also varied between rural and urban areas and between elites and non-elite families. In other words, there were internal variations in the emotional charges of Parde based on religion, profession, class, and so on. The receiving treatment in a Parde hospital may have conformed only to some patients' expectations and preconceptions. Missionaries plan to attract the patients by facilitating the practice of Parde sometimes could fail, leading to a form of feeling differently. So I'm going to pause here. It is just an abrupt pause, but that's briefly about what the book is about. Of course, I talk about different hospitals, about different forms of planning, and I also zoom in and talk about the zoom out somehow and talk about the location of the hospitals and discuss what that tells us about the relationship between mission and empire. Now I want to move on and talk about for the last maybe 5-7 minutes about how did I come to this project. So I start my book by referring to my first visit to the CMS hospital in Kerman, where I was born, and how the buildings impressed upon me. So essentially, I visited the hospital for the first time back in 2011, which is obvious here. It is registered as a national heritage, and I didn't know that it was built by British missionaries. And when I visited the hospital for the first time, I felt that I was in a familiar place. I state at the beginning of the book that this experience shaped the process of my research, which leads to the question of the place of emotions in the process of historical research and whether historians should pay attention to the emotional components of their work. If the field of the history of emotions has unbalanced the strict dichotomy between emotion and reason, then viewing affective and unemotional ways of assessing the past as radically opposite is a pitfall. Nevertheless, as Ben O'Gamel states, the problem arises when a specific emotional style is celebrated in favor of others in historical writing. And these are the sources that I'm going to refer to. For example, some of them take Rene Sentiles, I don't know if I pronounced her name correctly, discussion about how experiencing a place when something happened can provide intellectual insight into an historical actor's life. While researching the American actress Ada Isaac Mencken's early life in East Texas, Sentiles drove to Livingston to check a few regional archives, a trip which helped her to understand, and I quote, Mencken's ongoing relationship with this part of the country. She writes, driving through the lush but sparsely populated region, I realized that she was part of a glorious mythological past. She does not elaborate on how such a realization influenced her narrative, and therefore one may argue against her approach as being narcissistic rather than based on a more communal sense. Moreover, it seems that she viewed Mencken's experience as accessible insofar that it can be re-experienced. And this is the chief criticism that can be leveled at her approach. If, as Rob Bodice and Mark Smith state, things like disgust, anger, fear, sympathy, empathy, and so on are historically specific and contingent, then our own sensory and emotional reaction to the historical material we encounter cannot be permitted to be formative of historical analysis. The same criticism applies to Rochelli's account of her engagement with the archive of the German architect Otto Königsberg at the Swiss Institute for the Study of Egyptian Architecture in Cairo. Lee writes that she was, and I quote again, to share the physical experience of that private space of exposure with the architect, albeit 80 years later. But she could not have possibly stepped into a time machine, as she claims. Had the researcher been from Egypt of a different age, gender, or background, they would have felt the cold, the flush mechanism, and the small sink differently. The matter is not about being subjective or objective, but as Sarah Tarlow discusses, is about making a clear distinction between past emotions as a subject of study and examination of subjectivity of historians as a method. While our emotions can provide insight into feelings that motivated past actions, they should not be used to understand emotional experiences across time and space. Bodice and Smith suggest that historians must consciously consider their own apparently automatic reactions to their sources and cast them aside from the historical analysis. I suggest that historians should cast them aside insofar as they should not draw a parallel between their impression of visiting a building or an archive and what historical actors experience. I'm not here, I want to be clear that I'm not here rejecting Jane Rendell's work on site writing or the author's position, the site of writing on which Liz draws. But instead, I hope to see it from the vantage point of the history of emotions. Indeed, the history of emotions is what Rendell's referred to as an other place from which it is possible to explore our position and the difference it can make to what we can know. But the feelings implied in my encounter with buildings generated valuable insights and thus, in a sense, remained inside the work. However, I did not draw a parallel between my first impression of visiting the buildings and what patients experienced in the early 20th century. The impression that the buildings left on me was an awakening call, which was, to use Jane Hattrick's term, seduced me. It made me pick up on the words trust, affection, and friendship when reading the CMS materials and engage with the field of the history of emotions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara.
Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, would be nice that we see each other. Maybe everybody can switch on their video so that we are not alone here in the virtual space. Thank you very much. This was really great. And as we are all familiar with each other, I think we will have a nice discussion, a nice friendly discussion. And do somebody want to start and have a question? If not, I will jump in so that you feel comfortable to ask a question or make a comment. Oh no, there's already. Perfect. Lisa, you can start.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, Sara. This was wonderful and insightful. And I mean, you already told us what you have been working about, but this was great to see it in more detail. I have a very basic question because I'm I'm super intrigued with your approach, which I guess could or is an approach that is compatible with every kind of historical research. So I was wondering if you, like as an architecture historian, would say there's something like architecture specific to it. You know what I mean? Like, is there something like a special dimension of this affection and emotion you think inherent in architecture and architecture history?
May I? Do you mean like that what architectural history can contribute to the history of emotions?
Yeah, that as well. But yeah.
I guess that's a very big question. I'm trying to figure that out myself. Like what I have already done is to draw what historian of emotions do. For example, what Manik Shir referred to as emotional practices, which has been a very influential concept, and the article that I mentioned has been cited maybe over 1,000 times. And I say that because I have been reading this work over the last 5 years. But to say that I have been able to contribute myself to it as an architectural historian, I'm not sure to what extent I have been successful. I think I need to work more on that. But like they do talk about architecture, some of the historians of emotions. I know some architectural historians also have engaged with history of emotions, but I haven't necessarily come across any works that are like architectural historians contributing to it or saying what we can actually add to it. I haven't, and myself, I accept it. I haven't managed to do it myself.
Maybe Lisa, I can jump in that question and maybe reformulate it if I understood you right. You made this shift in perspective from healing body, saving souls to affecting body, saving souls. And I think I would like to know that you expand a bit on how the built environment, how the architecture itself affected the bodies, and maybe not only the bodies of the patients and their families. Can you also say something about how it affected the bodies of the missionaries or the medical staff, the medical missionaries? No. Yes.
Okay. So like I don't really talk about medical missionaries themselves, how they talk about how they felt in the, that's actually a good question, how they felt in the hospitals, like what they refer to a few times different medical missionaries when they visit us, when they, especially the new medical missionaries, when they join a medical mission. They talk in their letters or in their reports that this hospital is not like an English hospital. This is not what we expected. It's very different. And then they say, actually, this is good. It's not maybe sometimes good in terms of cleanliness, but it's good because it brings more patients to the hospital. And that's what is my argument. But as I mentioned, like what I want to try in this book, that to say that they try to attract the patients through the design of the hospitals, but to what extent they succeeded, that's a different question. And how the actually did the patients feel that they were in an English hospital, or they were in a missionary hospital, or maybe they were like in a kind of local hospital, or these are also things that we need to think about than just assuming that this was just an English hospital or a missionary hospital. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Lisa, is your question answered? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Then I will move to Daniela. Daniela, are you here?
I can't hear you.
I think you have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, too many buttons. Now I'm in. Thank you very, very much, Sara, for sharing with us, I mean, a little bit of the book. I'm very curious and look forward to it. And for also sharing some, points of departures and honest, let's say, challenge, I would say. For me, I mean, I'm more or less aligned with the same type of curiosity that was addressed already by Lisa and Frederike. I think your work is already a very interesting contribution, as from what we can see to both fields, if one could imagine. So don't be so yes.
I want to push myself.
Yes, you do. I would like to ask, for example, if you consider what were the traces or the sources that you've used, how much looking at through this perspective or this approach of history of emotions, how much they have changed your perspective to consider material, or now like material that was transformed into source for your work. So how much this, I mean, how much this history of emotions, or if it's a question of looking at the source differently, or it's also considering new source thanks to this approach of a history of emotions, I mean, so it would be very interesting if you could elaborate a little bit on that perspective, because I'm quite very interested too into the work of a history of emotions, and somehow it's for me it's interesting to understand these two possibilities. Can they open to new source, or open our eyes to consider new source, or through the traces that we've already bring as architecture historians, they can have new ways of looking at it, but the same source. These are the two possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. So I try to answer it as much as I can. So I think firstly, it maybe that was clear from the presentation or not. It at least helped me to read the materials in a different way, or to think about different things when I read the materials, to consider that, for example, here the missions were not just motivated by the climate or the accessible materials or these kind of things that we already have discussed, that there were other, like in this case, emotions also I'm trying to be careful to not use word emotion, but that they were motivated by other like sensibilities, not just with rational things like climate or accessible materials or this kind of things. I think that's one of the things that have helped me to read the materials. I think it also has helped me to read existing works in a different way, to pay attention to how people have used, talk about or refer to emotion words specifically without historicizing them, and how that can be somehow, this is not my term, I'm not going to say whose term it is, but one of historian of emotion who I really admire, but he says how emotion words get corrupted in historical writings. So I think that has helped me to think about, if I start historicizing emotions, maybe then I start looking at the buildings also differently. That's what else I can say about. And I think also, I think still I'm trying to work on that a little bit more. I think when we talk about these buildings, it's very difficult to find trace of the patients in this or the people who use the buildings, because they don't have the voice. Their voice doesn't exist in mission records. But I think by using history of emotions and trying to not generalize about how the people experience the buildings, maybe helps a little bit to try to think about at least how they experience the buildings, possibly. So I think that's another way that I have tried. I don't know. I hope that was something.
I actually had a similar question to Daniela. I also wanted to know a bit more about your sources, actually which sources you used and how you approach them. We saw a lot of photographs, and I wanted to know where these photographs are coming, where did you find them, what was the context of these photos, and also I guess you used a lot of written sources like newspaper articles, and in your introduction I saw also a diary. So yeah, it would be nice to know more about the sources you actually used.
I mainly use the missionary sources, and there are like this specific, the Church Mission Society, they have their own archive, which is based in Birmingham, and they have all the materials, plans, photographs, different like private letters, correspondence, and some of them are also available now, I think, online. And it's free. At my time, it was free to use and it was free to photograph, but I don't know about now. I also use some materials that I found in Iran, that I refer to them in the introduction. So when I traveled to Iran back in 2015, there are some materials in the National Library and Archive of Iran. They are not necessarily about architecture. They're mainly about when they wanted to import drugs or this kind of things. But there were some things about the buildings, or there were letters of the patients on when they wanted to sell one of the hospitals. They were this kind of, but it would have been, I think, better if I could have find more. But it's complicated to do archival work in Iran. For example, in the Anglican Church in Isfahan, which is still like active, but apparently there is a museum, but they didn't let me to get inside, and that's because of the complicated history that they have after the revolution, what they experienced. So I wasn't allowed to enter the church or to visit anything. So there are some materials, and of course I didn't travel to Pakistan. All of what I wrote is based on missionary records, and I think I mentioned it, that it is the missionary side of the history I'm not talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So the focus was a lot on the missionary perspective. Were you able to shed light on the emotions of the local people? I mean, how could you speculate that?
That was how I used the history of emotions to try to, and then like the specific way that I think about past experiences, like for example, to think about history of Iran and about different buildings that the people would possibly have visited, or in general to think about what their previous experiences or preconceptions, and then think about, for example, one way to think about is this Muslim Christian dichotomy didn't exist until later years of the 19th century. So it's important to make a distinction how the people experience buildings. If like in the early 19th century, which this distinction necessarily didn't exist, then late 19th century, when there was a pan-Islamic solidarity, and that didn't exist in the early 19th century specific, so people would have experienced the buildings somehow differently. So I don't talk about this now in the book, but yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Lisa has a second question.
I even have two, but you can decide which one you would like to answer, or if you would like to answer both. Because one of them is more about, it's more like a technical question about the general infrastructure of medical care at the time in the places that you studied. Because I was just wondering if there were what other facilities would have been there, or were these missions like the first to like even build a hospital there, or was it more like a competition for patients? So this is the technical question, and the other one is another methodological question, which kind of comes from my background also as a performance study scholar. Because I found that or if I understand you correctly, the method you propose is mostly about like distancing yourself as a researcher from your object of study, and then I find that also right now there's a trend, especially in performance research, but also elsewhere in historical research, to do like practice-led research or like embodied research, reenactments and things like that. And I was wondering if you think that these kinds of methodologies are like in opposition to what you propose, or are they compatible with this, with your approach?
Sure, thank you. About the first question, I think medical missions in many places, they were the first people who established a hospital. Like they were military or state hospitals, but some of them, they were not open to everyone. So in many places, they were the first to spend to engage in spending building hospitals at the local level, specifically for local level. For the second question, I kind of want to avoid answering it. So I haven't really read the works that you're referring to, so I can't really say anything. But what I know about historians of emotions, what they talk about, as I mentioned, they are very specific that we need to historicize emotions. That, for example, people in the early 19th century how, for example, we understand anger has changed, or like empathy is a kind of a 20th century invention. It didn't exist in the 19th century. So if we want to talk about 19th century and then we use the word empathy, we actually doing something, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. I don't want to use the word wrong, but I haven't read the work that you refer to, so I can't really say anything. So I don't know.
Okay, I think Lisa, your question is answered, right? Okay, then the next one is from Carsten.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you hear me? Because I mean, I'm just asking because I have a brand new notebook, so I'm not sure whether everything is working properly. So, yeah, many thanks, Sarah, for this very interesting presentation. We already had some discussion on that. I would be curious to know a bit more about the, let's say, theoretical frame of your work, because at a certain point of your presentation, you mentioned a text. I just forgot the author, which was referring to Bourdieu and his conception of, let's say, so the social condition of emotions and taste and this whole discourse, which is, I mean, at least until today, is quite interesting and also important. And that leads me back to your concept of emotions. I mean, if I got it right, it's not about, and that would be hardly possible to doing research on unmediated emotions. It's rather on, yeah, I would say socially conditioned emotions. And if that would be the case, also about standardized emotions, in the sense that we are all part of a society, of a culture, with certain standards in how to behave in certain situations, even in a hospital or in an exhibition room. And so, I mean, the question would be, what then would be the relation between the architecture you are dealing with these very interesting examples you have shown in your presentation, and how people are taking on certain kinds of attitudes, customs, habits, and how they are imitating each other in order to do so. And is that, I mean, is that the focus of your of the concept of emotion, or so that would be just an answer or a question for clarification, if I got it right, or are there other, let's say, dimensions of the concept and of your perspectives?
Thank you, Carsten. Yes, I think about the theoretical, I think the text you mentioned, I think is the Manishi article on emotional practices. I think she talked about that. So that's, the book is essentially draws on her on her formulation that emotions are doing. And then I talk, and she also used the word emotional setups or emotional practices. And then I refer to the buildings as a kind of emotional practice or an emotional setup. I don't know if that's clear enough, like how they design the buildings to facilitate certain practices. And those practices would facilitate doing emotions, for example, to stay in a hospital with their family and friends, or to cook in the hospital, or even they could drink tea in the ward or smoke the water pipe in the ward, which is very unusual in a hospital to smoke. Even like in the early 20th century, like that was forbidden in Britain, like the smoking in the ward. So I think I refer how the buildings facilitated these kind of practices, and how the missionaries allowed the patients to do these practices and then to feel in specific ways. And for the second thing that you mentioned, I think like exactly it is what you said. It's to see emotions as culturally, socially constructed, that are not universal, and are not timeless. And then also I try to some extent then to think about how patients might have felt in the hospital. For example, there is in one of the texts there were private wards in most of the hospitals, and they talk about how they allow the patients to bring their own beddings, their own whatever they wanted, and they actually use the word that they transformed the ward to a cozy living room. So I talk about how that might have made the patients to feel in the hospital, to attend to specifically to their emotional style or emotional world, to think how that might have made them feel in the, like, even if that did not attract them to the missionaries, which probably did not, but how it made them feel. I don't know. I hope that was clear.
So would you say that if you say that the built environment is affecting the bodies and is facilitating emotions as socially constructed emotions, so you say like the built environment has an agency in, like you say, it's an emotional setup, or does the built environment doesn't have an emotion, an agency, sorry?
I talk about it as an emotional setup, that it has agents. Whether it has agency, I think that then it depends on the people's previous experiences, preconceptions, but also I think we know that buildings can cause anticipated reactions, or that someone might feel out of place, or all of these kind of things. So yes and no, probably. Daniela.
Yeah, I think you showed that with the Parda system, with the hospital, where you said like the Parda hospital has a familiarity for certain people, so it anticipates certain emotions, or it's trying to facilitate certain emotions, but it could be that it is confronted with people who are not fond of the Parda system, and then it just creates the complete contrary emotion, right? This is
exactly. And it's also in this case of these buildings, they talk about like patients traveling from different cities. So it's also, they're already coming from different like backgrounds, like someone coming from, they talk about these specific patients traveling to the hospital from a very small village on a donkey, coming to the hospital, then describe about what she sees. But like, it's probably very different from someone that was from the city, or maybe they knew the hospital already. So like, it's just thinking about all these different people and not trying to generalize about how they experience buildings, I think.
no, I really think this is a very valuable and good approach. Are there any other questions? Well, then we are perfectly in a 1 hour presentation. I am impressed. I enjoyed it a lot. I think I can speak for everybody else that we enjoyed it a lot. You did a great work, and it will be a wonderful book, which will be soon published. And we'll see you for the next CCSA talk, which is, and now I have to look it up. It's somebody jump in and tell me when it is.
Next
28.
28, yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. 28th of December. And yeah, look in our website and then you can see it. And very great that so many people joined, and I wish you a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone. That was great.